Hi everyone, thank you for stopping by today. My name's Lara, adoptee, adoption wellbeing researcher and psychotherapist. From the beginning of this year, I've been volunteering for a not-for-profit organisation here in the UK called How to Be Adopted. And How to Be Adopted offers support for adoptees in and around the London area. And I have, as I say, joined forces as a volunteer with them. On Saturday, we ran a virtual retreat, which I think was a huge success. And I know some of you guys were there, so those of you who came along, thank you so much for coming. And I hope you got some value from it. What you're about to watch is the presentation that I did on Saturday at the retreat, which runs to about 35 minutes. So I hope you find it useful. But before I put that up, I'm kind of new to YouTube, but I have recently realised that many of you are viewing my channel without subscribing. And of course, that's absolutely fine. But the whole point of the channel from my perspective is to try and get some of this research and the message out there. And as it turns out that if you are able to like and subscribe, then that message will be widespread a lot sooner. So if you could do that, if you think the channel's worth doing that, then I would be really, really grateful. The presentation that I gave on Saturday talks about adoptee guilt, which is one of the lesser known, lesser discussed aspects of what it is to be an adoptee. So I do go into that in a little more detail in the presentation that follows. And as you're watching the presentation, I would just encourage you to think about not only how that manifests for the adoptee in terms of the guilt, also the loneliness and isolation that brings about. After all, the genetic bond with a parent is such a comforting one in the main. And, you know, us adoptees, we've had to grow up, we've had to develop and go through difficulties without that really kind of close natural genetic bond, which is so comforting. So I just invite you to bear that in mind as you are watching the presentation. If you are watching and you find yourself kind of sad or a little bit triggered as a result, please do take note of some of the suggestions that we make at the end. Exercise some self-care, get yourself outside, take a walk in nature just to rebalance yourself. All of the things that we recommend will apply. Above all, be kind to yourself and stay safe. And before we begin, I just want to say thank you to you all for coming today. It's one of your days off if you work, but if you don't, weekends are often days spent doing other things, getting those all-important jobs done. And I recognise that obviously many of you have given up that free time to come along today. And for that, I just want to say thank you. And I'm saying thank you because from the perspective of somebody who works with people, I know and recognise, as do we all by now, that all a human ever really wants is to be seen, heard and validated. And in being here today, you are doing that. You are doing that for each one of us. You may not have thought of it in that way, but by your very presence, you're validating another person who's here, another person who has potentially struggled throughout their lives with issues and feelings and had no one to express that to, certainly no one who would understand that. And so, as I say, by being here, you're doing that for all of us. To prove the point, 18 months ago, I set up a little YouTube channel because, as many of you know, I carried out research into well-being in adults who are adopted. And my findings, I believe, are very important in terms of the future generations of adoptees,
It has something to offer to those of us, excuse me, who are already adults. There is something to be taken from that, namely validation, but also other ideas around how we can help ourselves moving forward. But future generations, I would hope, would be able to benefit from research and research like mine. And so I set up a YouTube channel and I put out some of the work and the videos and the findings. And without fail, every week I get emails from people all around the world. And I happen to know that a couple of you are here today, maybe more. But those emails sometimes are long and sometimes are short. But 2 words come through in all of those emails, and those 2 words are thank you. And I think that to me proves the point that I was trying to make about validation. So thank you to all of you for being here. I want to start my presentation today with a little story. Some of my work is met by people out there, people not involved in this work. Let's call them the average person or the lay person. Some of what I do and what I talk about, it's met with, at best, bewilderment and confusion, and at worst, anger. And part of what I do and part of what people like me, Jilly and Claire, do is to try and have that narrative, that general narrative that's out there changed, because it's so important that people recognise that our struggles are and were and will always be in many cases very real. And it's been enough of a challenge to have people within the space, the adoption space, to recognise that, and that has now happened and is gaining pace. That was enough of a challenge, but to have people outside of that world recognise that is a huge challenge. Now, I don't know if I'll achieve that in my lifetime. Very, very unlikely, because I'm already a good halfway through my life. But that's my dream. My dream is that it would be recognised by people so that we don't have to work so hard for validation. A story that I'm about to tell you involves a conversation that I had not too long ago with a gentleman, an older man, whose late wife was adopted. And he was so, I don't know whether it was proud or to support possibly his confusion or his bewilderment, he relayed this story to me. His late wife had a conversation with her mother when she was a little girl, whereby the mother said to her, "Do you want to find your real mummy?" And the little girl, shocked and taken aback, turned around and responded to her mum, "But no, Mum, you're my real mum." When that story was relayed to me, I can't tell you the million thoughts that happened simultaneously in my head. My response was one of silence. What this gentleman obviously was trying to say, and it was coming from a well-meaning place, but what he was trying to say to me was his late wife was not struggling, had no struggles, had no desire to find her real family, if you want to put it that way, her birth family, as I think they called it. And all I'll say to that is, how do we ever know what's really going on in someone's heart and in someone's head? And I think this probably leads quite nicely into Jilly's session later, because we all have a story. We all have a story that we tell ourselves. And what we say out to the world is very often in line with that story. And what we say to the world comes from a place of fear very often. So why was the mother asking that question? Was she asking that question from a place of love and support? Or was she asking that question from a place of fear, of rejection? And why did that child respond in that way? Did she respond in that way out of fear? Did she respond in that way because on some level she knew that's what her mother wanted her to say? And so it's so multi-layered, isn't it? It's so complex. And we can never take what we hear at face value. That sort of segues quite nicely into my presentation, which is about adoptee guilt. So, as if we didn't have enough to contend with, eh? Well, let's get into it. All of the aspects of being adopted are not well known and not spoken about enough, in my opinion. But one of the aspects that is very infrequently discussed is that of guilt. So I was working with a client several years ago in my capacity as therapist. Obviously my client would not have known that I was adopted. My client was struggling to conceive, and she was going through a very real, difficult journey. And it's absolutely not about taking that away from her or any other parents who adopt, because if you've been there and you're trying to conceive, you know, we all have these stories about how our lives are going to turn out in our head, and when they don't, it can be it can really shake the foundation of your life. And if you think that you're going to, I don't know, let's say get married and have kids, and then you can't have kids, that really is a problem and can cause a lot of grief. So I definitely would not take that away from her. But at the time of the sessions, this lady was very much against adoption. And it's natural, really, in a way, because we're all wired to want to have our own biological offspring. It's there by design, and I shall come on to that a little bit more. But I was witness to her journey from being against adoption to seriously considering it when it was all that was left in terms of her choices. So why guilt? Well, look, you see, these parents often are going into adoption because they have no other choices. And as I say, I am probably more than many very understanding of how that decision is reached and the painful journey that a mother, a woman, a couple, but the woman goes through in order to make that decision. But let's just say she gets to the point of her life of deciding to adopt, and they go through the process, which is also quite tricky. I am not able to speak from experience on that side, but I know that it's a tricky process. At the point of wanting to adopt, you are everything. You are the answer to all of the problems. So perhaps you're very, very, very much wanted. And at this point, the dream of the happy family finally comes together. So they want to try and love you as their own, you see. They want to make you their own. And here's where some of the problems begin, because the stories that we tell ourselves are so key in terms of how we view our lives and the feelings, even the feelings that we have in some way. So this can be the problem because very few adoptive families, and let's say the couple or the mother, the woman, I know that adopting couples are not always both female, so, adopting couples do not always consist of a female. That's not what I'm talking about here, but that's my experience personally of women who cannot conceive, because there is a lot of grief around that, and there is a lot of research around that as it feeds into the need for well-being, the need for adoptee well-being. That means that the mother who cannot conceive needs to have grieved for that before she enters into an adoption. So that's why I focus on women who can't conceive as opposed to anything else when I'm talking about this. But very few adoptive families have been aware of the struggles. So, you know, if you put yourself into their position, it's all about the family and bringing this baby or young person home to begin to love them as their own. But if you're not aware of the struggles of the adoptee, you're not aware that they're going to have attachment and bonding complications. You're not aware that they're going to go on to struggle to process their separation trauma, the loss that is very, very real. You know, the taking away of a baby from its biological parent, from its biological mother in particular. There are impacts, obviously fathers feature, and I'm not saying for 1 minute they don't, but there's something very primal about the connection with the female. Those months that the child is in the mother's uterus, and it's a different sort of trauma, and it's a huge loss, and it's a loss which is unable to be articulated because we're pre-verbal, and it's not something that we're feeling or experiencing consciously. It's all happening unconsciously. So there's a grief, there's a loss, and there's unprocessed trauma. That baby, and let's say that's a baby that's brand new, as was the case with me, with the blank slate theory, or the vanilla baby, as I like to say. You know, the belief was, and still is in many cases, that you can just imprint yourself and your family on that blank slate. We now know that's absolutely not the case, and there's lots of problems. So if there's a narrative that ignores all of this, what you're creating now is an environment in which not only can that child not heal and move forward, there's no conversation around the pain and the suffering that child is experiencing. The child is then ending up feeling guilty because they're in a family whereby they are being showered with a particular type of love, the type of love that the parent wants to offer, but which ignores all of the needs of the adoptee. And that is because the adoptee may not, in many cases, be able to return the love in the same way. So it's not quite unrequited, but you know, it's complicated because in many cases, if you discover that you don't really love somebody as much as you thought you should, in a normal kind of adult relationship, you can end the relationship. And disclaimer, adoptees and relationships, that's a very complicated subject, and it's one that is for a different conversation. But I suppose what I'm saying here is, if a child is in an environment where the feelings that they have toward the parent are different, complicated, complex, then it's a similar setup in a way. We care for them, we love them, you know, in a way, because yes, they're caregivers, but there isn't that biological bond. Can we love them in the same way? So research shows that the bond can be improved by open communication and discussion within the family around the pain and the suffering and the difficulties that an adoptee has, contact with the biological family. All of those things help the bond. So there'll need to be some research around whether families with open communication around this, whether that individual goes on to suffer less guilt, but that's obviously one that's going to be needed way down the line. But the adoptee, in my experience, cannot necessarily return the love to the parent in the same way that biological children can. You see, the genetic bond is a powerful one, and there is research into this. Again, it's in order to protect the species. It's inbuilt. It's an unconscious reaction. We will do anything, and for those of you who have children, if we're well, let's say, psychologically, and not going through something ourselves, we will do anything. We will go to the ends of the earth to protect our children, and it's by design. But it also goes the other way, and we've all heard of children who end up being carers to their parent and doing things for them. And yes, it's hard work, and yes, it's exhausting and tiring, but they're doing it because they have a bond to the parent. As I say, this is by design. Evolutionary psychology says this is for protection of the species. We survive in that way. sense. So I wonder, where does this leave us? You know, where does this leave the bond between the adopter and the adoptee? Well, I've already told you that, you know, I think women and families, couples who decide to adopt have already gone through a psychological process of landing at that place. They've gone through a process of squaring that for themselves, if you like. You know, ordinarily at the start, the dream is to have your own children. I don't think many people would argue with that. We know that there are people that do that. And in some senses, those bonds tend to be better because there are fewer expectations on the adoptee when that happens. But in most cases, where adoptions are taking place because the child is filling a need in the parents, then it's a different setup, and the parent has gone through that process and they get to the point of bringing this child home, and they want to be the parent. So the story that they're telling themselves is that I am this child's parent, and there's nothing different about the way I feel about this child. So we know that research shows that genetic feelings are different, but the stories, our inner stories, are very, very powerful as well. And that it's my belief that is what is happening, because many parents do report, many mothers and parents and couples do report feeling the same. Of course, I can't get inside their heads and truly say whether that's measurable or not, but I think something happens whereby they do put themselves in the position of the parent of that child. And in some ways that's good, because it will protect the child from physical danger, and it will make sure that that child survives. But does that child thrive? Because psychologically there may be a need from the part of the parent for something which that child cannot give. What happens if, you know, the grief that they are still carrying from not being able to conceive is still playing out within the bond? And again, as I mentioned, this was one of the things that came out in my research. What if there's something else that's happened in one of the parents' life where they have a very strong need of love from another, and maybe the child becomes the focus of that? So as I've mentioned, I think their narrative or story then becomes consistent with being a parent. So it's very interesting. But the problems begin when the parent is expecting this in return from the adoptee. And there are many, many, many cases that I know of where this is the case. And it causes lots of grief, it causes lots of upset, and it causes a sense of guilt. And that's the subject of this presentation. And as adoptees, I feel we might be aware very early, because, you know, we have a sense of something at all times. Myself, as a young person, I was always aware of this very physical kind of heaviness in my belly, and it was a sense that something was telling me that something was off. I wasn't sure what it was. I knew that I felt like I was sort of in an alien environment, if you like. And when I say alien, it was not my environment that I would have been born into, let's say. And so I had a sense that something was off by this very heavy physical feeling in my belly. And then later, as I became more sophisticated in terms of my mental processing, as we develop as humans, you know, as you enter into teenage and young adulthood, you're able to process things around you differently, and your awareness is different. And as that began to happen, the feeling that I had in the pit of my stomach began to encompass a feeling of guilt, and it was very much on the focused around this. You struggle potentially to be the child where you struggle potentially to be the child that you know that your parent wants or needs you to be, let's say, because they have no way of knowing that you can't be that. They have no knowledge that you might respond differently to a biological child. So, you know, potentially we end up just feeling like we're falling short of our duties or their expectations, and I put the word duties in double quotes because it's kind of loaded, but the things that possibly the biological siblings or other biological children might do, it doesn't just come naturally, and that's where I think the pain can set in. So many adoptees live their whole lives feeling guilty about it, and knowing that they're falling short or that they're unable to return the love in the same way. And of course, this is a very hot topic in terms of adoption, isn't it? Should an adoptee feel grateful? Well, no, absolutely. One shouldn't feel grateful. And yet, on some level, the narrative around us feels like we should have some sort of level of gratitude. What would have happened if we hadn't have been adopted, and all those questions, and of course we're going to fight against the notion of gratitude, and yet we probably carry it within us on some level. Who knows? It depends. We all have different stories. One of my favourite books is by Betty Jean Lifton, and she wrote this book, Twice Born, Memoirs of an Adopted Daughter. And when I read this book, there was so much of it that jumped out at me, you know, that validation again. And there have been a couple of books that have done that for me, because growing up, as I mentioned previously, the community, it wasn't there. There was no opportunity to speak with other adoptees and explain and explore the feelings. And this book did that, because it just every time I turned a page, there was something on it. Excerpts from one of my favourite books. She was asking from me something she could not articulate and which I could not give. And we each had our roles, and we continued to play them. I resented this woman who was my mother by a fluke of fate and a legal decree, but a primitive love still held me to her. Or was it guilt or gratitude? The Japanese speak of the debt that can never be repaid. That's what held me to this mother. A child's helplessness in his debt. And I think that sums up so eloquently, I guess, the feeling many adoptees have. So we already have a very difficult trajectory of adjustment. You know, it's well known now that anxious feeling, low mood, addiction to all sorts of things, drugs, alcohol, relationships, many different things, are some of the ways in which we deal with the pain and the trauma, and the lack of self-worth and lack of self-esteem, the identity issues. So on top of that, now guilt. We can feel inadequate because we feel like there's something wrong with us. Again, we feel flawed for the inability to return the love. And it can take us further inwards when already we're very much inwards, I think, in many cases. And it can result in an anxiety. And so we talked about how anxiety manifests in people. And yeah, for me, it was very much that sense that I was carrying around a heavy stone in my stomach all the time. And later that can turn into resentment, which is very toxic. And the parents may result in a feeling that they've done something terribly wrong or failed somehow. And really that's quite unfair. It's not fair to expect something of people who have no idea. Well, you might say it should be obvious, you know, that if you take a child away from its parent, natural parent, that child's going to struggle. Well, it sort of isn't to many people. They'll question their own parenting skills. I mean, generic parenting skills are very different to parenting adoptees. We now know this, and I think I have got a video on that somewhere, but this isn't about making allowances around general things that are happening in the day-to-day, but this is about having an understanding of the psychological needs of an adoptee versus the others. And then unhelpful comments, because, you know, this pain that gets set up occasionally will come out in a negative and a toxic way, and what would have become of you? In other words, you know, we did a good thing. Where's the love? Where's the appreciation? And coming from a place of pain from the parent. Or perhaps you wish you'd been adopted by a different family. You know, it's not personal, it's biological. It would have been the same with any family. The problems might have been slightly different, but the fundamental problems would be the same, because we can't respond to the people who are not our biological parents in the same way, in the exact same way as we can to the genetic parent. And that's just, unfortunately, just how it is. The next best thing is obviously awareness of this issue on the part of the parent, to sort of help the adoptee navigate some of this. My personal favourite comment is, how come other adoptees don't feel like this? Yeah. And so relationship problems set up, toxic exchange of bad feelings and drifting, distancing, all the usual. An imbalanced relationship in essence, you know, the sense that an adoptee might think, I'm theirs, but they're not mine. And that's very powerful, I think, but really sort of sums up the problem. The answer, well, I think for those of us who were adopted into the blank slate or vanilla baby era, it's just about acknowledging that it wasn't our fault, really. We need to be able to forgive ourselves for not being able to return those feelings in the same way, and accept that it's part of our story, and our stories are so vital, so we have to accept that it is part of what happened and it's not our fault. Maybe if you feel safe enough that you can attempt some open communication within the family, if it feels safe enough to do so. But again, in my experience, it's a tricky one, and because these conversations challenge their story, if you like, and you have to have a level of patience and understanding and ability to mentalize on the part of the parent to have this end even remotely well. But you know, there have been cases and there have been times where it has happened. And so what about future adoptees? Well, this is where it can be different, isn't it? Education for the families who are thinking of adoption, understanding that the bond may not be there in the same way from this child. Allow the child to exist authentically with all their complex feelings. And I think if an adoption takes place within this narrative, it's a very, very different outcome. And I think it takes a special kind of a person to be able to go into an adoption. Certainly that journey that I spoke of before, from the desire to have one's own child to then going into adopting a child, but then adopting a child with a different set of expectations than they would have had having their own child. I think that takes takes a lot of work for most, and I'm not sure that many could achieve that, if I'm honest. That's just my sense, because I know how we do things, because it feels right for us in the main as a human species. In terms of healing, it's about accepting our own limitations as adoptees and forgiving ourselves. And doesn't mean that you're broken or flawed if you can't feel the same. And all the other work, you know, it's just acknowledging that this is a specific area of psychological adjustment that you are having to contend with. So, you know, journaling, community, be explicit, recognize if this is something that you are dealing with or have had to deal with. As we know that being with ourselves, going inwards, is helpful. Many of us avoid doing that because it's too painful, but in truth it's the only way towards healing. So some sort of yoga, mindfulness and meditation, beginning that sort of forgiveness process from that position, seeing support groups and therapists who understand the painful transition and the particular elements of adoption that present. Going out in nature is very, very powerful, and that's a whole other presentation, but EMDR is based on the discovery that the bilateral stimulation of the brain, the eyes, the legs is very therapeutic. As I mentioned, journaling our stories, and journaling, this can be done if it's too painful to do it in the first person because it's too triggering. I suggest writing stories or journaling in the third person, as though you're writing about another character or person, because what that can do is it can acknowledge what's going on, but without that feeling quite so raw, certainly in the first instance. Poetry, lyrics, stories, all of this stuff, everything creative is absolutely brilliant. So, before I say goodbye, I just want to acknowledge that I'm absolutely not somebody who's interested in apportioning blame to anybody about anything. My work is very much about understanding how we as humans come to the place in our lives and experience the things in our lives that we do, how our feelings are set up and the things that contribute towards that in order for us to then move forward from that place. It's really unfair to think of potentially apportioning blame towards people who were very limited in terms of what they could and could not do. Secondly, guilt is not just limited to us as adoptees. If you look at the adoption triangle, if you like, each corner of that triangle has reasons for potential guilt. The biological mother who is forced into giving up her child, or the biological mother who gives up her child and later regrets it and lives with guilt for the rest of her life, or the adoptive parent who's struggling every day because they have realised the struggles of their child all their life and have just realised that they weren't aware of it, and they have to deal with the guilt of that for the rest of their life as the parent. So I just want to say goodbye. Thank you for listening. Take care of yourself, exercise some self-care, and try and forgive yourself. Thank you.
Thank you for watching the presentation. I hope you found that of use. Actually, in just a few hours, I'll be speaking at a PAC Day Voices of Adopted People here in the UK. And I also will be uploading that presentation in the next few days. That presentation is going to be the research findings that I carried out into well-being in adults who are adopted as babies or infants. And as I said, as I promised, I will be uploading that presentation on here also in a few days' time. As I mentioned earlier, How to Be Adopted here in the UK is all about providing support for adoptees. We are actually going to be running an in-person retreat next June, between the 9th and the 11th of June here in the UK in the Lake District, and below I will put links to the information, and if you're interested in finding out a little bit about that and potentially coming along, then please do follow the link and take a look. Meanwhile, stay safe and thank you for watching. Take care.